2, 1. So I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's Property Standards and Yards Bylaw public meeting. The hope tonight is that everybody will have the opportunity to listen to the presentation provided by Dillon Consulting, and that anybody who's in our listening area or who's watching would be able to make comment, maybe answer some questions. Obviously, if we can't answer questions, or we get questions after the presentation, we will ensure that our website and Speak Up Smiths Falls are updated with the information. I'd like to start off first with the land acknowledgement. On September the 8th, 2022, we acknowledge that this sacred land on which Smiths Falls is now located has been a site of human activity for over 10,000 years and is rich in Indigenous history. This land is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. We are grateful to the Algonquin ancestors who cared for the land and water in order that we might meet here today. We are grateful also to the Algonquin people for their contribution in the making of the Rideau Canal, which runs through Smiths Falls. We are mindful of broken covenants and the need to reconcile with our relations. Together, may we care for this land and each other, drawing on the strength of our mutual history of nation building through peace and friendship, being mindful of generations to come. Right now, if everybody would please participate, I'd like to take a moment of silence in honor of Queen Elizabeth, who passed away today after serving 70 years as monarch. So if we could just take a couple of moments of silence, please. Thank you, everyone. Right now, I would just like give you all a quick update on how we've gotten to where we are this evening. So in early 2022, Council passed a resolution to add the yards naturalization provision to our property standards bylaw. In 2021, the town's housing task force also requested that Council take a look at the property standards bylaw to make landlords more accountable for their properties. To that end, we've worked with Dillon Consulting now for many months and who've brought a proposed bylaw forward. Again, this is a draft bylaw. Your comments and questions this evening are going to form part of that bylaw. That's why we're here this evening. Right now, I would like to hand the meeting over to Rory from Dillon Consulting. He can introduce his team and he's going to provide a PowerPoint presentation. If anyone has questions or comments, they are encouraged to use the chat window here if you're participating in the Zoom format, or you can raise your virtual hand and we will acknowledge when you can ask your question and take yourself off of mute. For those watching on Facebook Live, we encourage you to use the comment section. I will be monitoring that and we'll pose those questions or comments to the group. We have an hour and a half for this meeting. So like I said earlier, if we don't get to questions or comments, we will ensure that those questions or comments answered in Speak Up Smiths Falls or our website. So I encourage all of you, if you, after the fact, have a question that you'd like to ask or like clarification on, reach out at info@smithsfalls.ca and we will upload all of that information onto Speak Up Smiths Falls. And I think that is it for me for housekeeping, Rory. So I will hand the microphone over to you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Carrie. And a warm good evening to everyone that's joining us. Perhaps from all corners of the internet, as the case may be with the beauty of the internet, you can be anywhere and participate in something local to your community. I'm pleased to be joined this evening with colleagues Martina Bronstein, Ish Chowdhury, and Angel Bankale. We're a group of planners and landscape professionals really trying to help Smiths Falls and the community navigate their way forward on an update to the property standards and the yards bylaw. There's two things going on at the same time. And what I'd like to do this evening is share with you a little bit of the journey that we've been on, offer you some background in case you missed a previous presentation. I'd like to allow for a little bit of catch up there so we're all on the same page in terms of what we've learned thus far. And then with the draft bylaws that have been posted on the Speak Up Smiths Falls website, provide an opportunity to identify the key changes and use that as a means to then encourage as many questions as our audience and participants would like to ask us, because that's what we're here for tonight, is to be available to answer any questions and to listen very carefully to what the community is sharing with us. So without any further ado, I will continue into the presentation. And again, a little bit of a public service message in regards to the Zoom platform specifically. I think microphones are muted. The good news is it looks like we have a small group today, so we won't be as formal for the Q&A as we might have been with a much larger group. And we do encourage you when we get to Q&A to use the raise hand function. We'll unmute your microphone, and we actually look forward to having a little bit more of a dialogue this afternoon. Not so robotic, which is sometimes the case when you have to manage a crowd of 300 or 400 people for a consultation. For anyone that may have joined us by telephone, that's not actually connecting via the internet, you can use the *6 function on your phone to be able to indicate a raise hand feature. Doesn't look like we have any phone participants, but just in case. And again, a brief reminder that the website to go to for further information is speakupsmithsfalls.com. You will find versions of the draft bylaws there. And again, after tonight's session, we'll make sure that this presentation is uploaded as well. And I think we have a really nice group here. And so again, I'm open to hearing everyone's perspective, and I hope that you're open to hearing your neighbors and your fellow colleagues' perspectives as well. So let's move forward in terms of sharing the project purpose. You heard a bit of it from Carrie already, so I won't go deeply into it. But there are really two things going on at the same time as it relates to the mandate that Council had provided to staff and the consulting team. And, you know, as we try to encourage and live more sustainably, we find ourselves from time to time coming across circumstances where rules, regulations, bylaws, and the like haven't kept up with trends or philosophies. And so here's an opportunity as it relates to yards naturalization to kind of move things forward a little bit, move the yardstick forward. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of things that we're hearing about as it relates to housing crisis in Ontario. And one of the things that came up from Council was a real focus on housing quality. That was one of their priorities, and they wanted something to be looked at there. And the Housing Task Force had suggested that we look at matters of housing quality as it relates to property standards. So this is really a two-in-one project. We're looking at the yards component and the quality of housing component in two separate bylaws. The one that's a little bit more substantive of the two pieces is the yard naturalization. So I'd like to speak to that a little bit. And certainly I think this comes from an understanding that there are different views of sustainability. There's different ways that we can live. And the way that you know, people approach their property and landscaping in particular can be different and can be okay. And interestingly enough, since starting this work with Carrie and the town of Smiths Falls, I've happened to notice even in my own neighborhood this season, how some of the members in my own community are starting to make different choices around their landscape treatments. And they are moving away from kind of that manicured lawn, and they are introducing wildflowers, and they are introducing other types of vegetation. And one of my very good friends has actually planted and put up signage indicating that she's trying to encourage pollinators. Vegetation, and one of my very good friends has actually planted. So there is room for this concept of naturalization in the modern world and in the way forward. So we want to make sure that we're going to encourage that to happen. So the next one is on housing quality. Really what we are finding is that there are a lot of housing challenges across Ontario. Those housing challenges are felt in our local communities. And there really is only one entity in Ontario that can effectively deal with matters as it relates to elements of housing quality. And a lot of this stuff shows up at the landlord and tenant board. And that really only matters if you're a renter. And that group, specifically from the rental side of things, is inundated with significant issues. They can't deal with day-to-day or minor matters. And so people that are concerned about housing quality, not only renters, but in general, are looking for municipalities to step in. And we are noticing that municipalities more and more are stepping in to deal with matters of housing quality. And there is a certain degree of legislative empowerment that municipalities have under the guise of property standards, and I'll share with you a little bit more about that. But we want to have some reasonable standards that allow Smiths Falls to be able to play an effective, positive role here on the matters of housing quality. So in terms of where we've been, you heard Carrie give you a little bit of an overview. We are really a little bit down the road from when we had started. We've done some research and we've made one presentation already. We've put together a working version of both of these bylaws, and we're really pausing at a very important moment. We don't want to run off too far down the road at this point. We decided it was very important to receive public comment and feedback, and to leave the door open for that public comment and feedback, and for us to have not made up our mind, and for us to approach the next stage of the work with a very open mind, recognizing that a draft is simply a draft when it comes to an exercise like this, and there's so much good information that we gather by consulting with the public and our community and stakeholders, and through that learning we can actually create, I think, a very good product to then give to council. And that's really where we are right now, and that's our mindset and our philosophy at this stage of the game. So I'll share with you a bit of the emerging findings on both yard naturalization and property standards. This was a presentation we gave earlier, and what I've done is boiled it down so it's a little bit more brief. But for those that did not have the benefit of that earlier presentation, you'll get a bit of a Coles Notes version or a short recap. So as you've heard me say, this concept of a more naturalized yard versus a manicured yard is certainly coming to the fore, and other municipalities are embracing it. And there are different types of approaches that other jurisdictions are taking. Some of them have very comprehensive guides, and a very progressive regime, trying to encourage certain types of plant species. And others still maintain a certain degree of regulation around management of growth and prohibiting certain types of plants. So we are seeing those types of things. Regardless of the move towards a more sustainable kind of choice as it relates to gardens and yards and buildings, we are still seeing that there's a need to uphold basic maintenance standards. So regardless of the various jurisdictions, there are touch points as it relates to making sure that someone who does have a lawn doesn't have a lawn with grass that is 3 feet high in a community, in a neighborhood, in a town, or in a city setting. Making sure that garbage is not piling up, and various types of weeds that are considered noxious are managed. And again, this is common in terms of the research that we've done. The other thing that we've learned is we are seeing a separation between what you would call property standards and what you would call yards. And there's some interesting kind of case law and history there that I'll share with you anecdotally in just a moment, about why it's important to kind of choose the tool appropriately as we move forward in this concept of more sustainable living and more sustainable choices. And last but not least, we saw that while many municipalities and jurisdictions are promoting urban agriculture in a variety of different ways, they don't necessarily end up in bylaws. What that means is there's not an intense regime around regulating, setting out rules, and trying to enforce things on urban agriculture. This simply, just trying to encourage it and not trying to deter it. And I think that's, there's some sensibility there. So the other thing that we found on the way forward here is a lot of municipalities have supplementary guides. There's pamphlets, brochures, toolkits that are available in these other jurisdictions. They are actually encouraging people to make these alternative choices than the classic kind of 1950s manicured lawn. And hey, for those that would like to have a 1950s style manicured lawn, by all means, you can keep that. For those that would like to do something different, I think there's room for that as well. From time to time, what we do find is that those guides are helpful. There's only so much that we can do in a bylaw, because bylaw is like a set of rules. And these guides provide an opportunity for better interpretation, and essentially becomes a very useful tool to reduce conflict. And that's important in terms of the realities of Smiths Falls being still a small community. It doesn't have a swarm of 25 bylaw enforcement officers driving around the community measuring everyone's grass. And it doesn't ever intend to be a municipality like that. So, it really is about, each member of the community just being a good neighbor and making some wise choices. And the brochures and these types of things definitely help that. As we continue forward, you heard me say, we want to focus property standards. We want to focus that bylaw on minimum maintenance requirements, kind of the classic business of property standards, the genesis of where property standards came from in law from many, many decades ago. And we want to move the concept of naturalized yards and greenery and landscaping and those types of things into a yard bylaw. And other municipalities have done this, and it's a wise move. I said I would explain to you the rationale for that. So when we go back in time, there was a period when in Ontario, we had something called the Planning and Development Act. And one of the things that intended to do was to make sure people were not inappropriately developing their land or excavating their property. And within that very, very old, now defunct piece of legislation that does not exist, there was a piece in there about alteration of land. And that became property standards. In the passage of time, that alteration of land component moved out of the old Planning and Development Act of many decades ago into the Ontario Building Code Act. And when we think about building code, we think about regulating buildings and safe buildings and habitable buildings. And so that's where property standards migrated. It migrated from a prohibition on inappropriate development and alteration of land into a piece of legislation focused on safe, appropriate, properly regulated building. And what happened is, if there was anything that had moved along with it, it brought it with it. So what happened is that a lot of stuff around the good maintenance and of land got tangled up in a very strict piece of legislation around buildings. And so that's why we are seeing the two pieces now being separated. We're removing the landscaping piece from the strict legislation, being the property standards component, where there's a lot of rules and regulations and very important things to be done as per the letter of the law. And we're moving these types of things into a yard bylaw. The yard bylaw sits under a piece of legislation in Ontario called the Municipal Act that allows municipalities to pass a wide variety of bylaws for the good governance of the community. But moving it away from the building code gives us an ability to put it under legislation where a municipality has flexibility and can then, if asked to intervene in a particular circumstance, has the ability to apply a little bit more discretion. And that I think is better suited. So there's a little history lesson on law and property and building and stuff like that in Ontario. But the long and short of it is that's why we have both a property standards and a yard bylaw that we are putting together and updating for the town of Smiths Falls. And where is yard naturalization going to go? It's going to go in the yard bylaw under the Municipal Act, where we can actually have some flexibility and some discretion when the municipality is asked to investigate something or intervene. And hopefully those cases in the grand scheme of time are few and far between, as we would hope them to be. So let me just touch on quality of housing before I move on. So this is the second part of this two-part exercise. We are finding that municipalities, again, as you've heard me say, are addressing emerging issues of housing quality, trying to define what an infestation is, so that in case there's a need for the municipality to intervene, they have very clear criteria on what that may be. Brampton, for example, deals with mold and mildew in buildings and has a regulation around that. We find that it's quite common for other municipalities to have bylaws that speak to matters of snow removal. And if we have unsafe accumulations of snow, there's an ability for the municipality to intervene on that property and address that with the occupant or the owner. And so there is an opportunity here for Smiths Falls in terms of kind of following the best practices to update the property standards bylaw around some of these particular subject matter as well. And so again, I think the most important thing that I'd like to share as we leave the background and I get us ready for a bit of a walkthrough of the draft bylaws is that everything that the municipality is trying to do is it's trying to encourage good things to happen. You know, we believe philosophically that 99.9999% of humans are good people and just want to do good things. And they want to live a peaceful, happy life in their community alongside their neighbors. The reality is in life in municipal government is every so often there's a circumstance where they have to intervene. And every so often when that happens, they need clear rules and requirements if they have to intervene. And when they do so, they need those clear rules and requirements to help them decide if they're going to get fully involved, you know, and if things are going to go down a particular path, or if it's simply a matter of raising the flag, increasing that awareness, and then knowing that that particular owner or occupant is just going to look after it, and then the problem is solved. And so really there's an inherent philosophy here as it relates to the life in municipalities and what bylaws are intended to do. So with that, I'd like to point out some key things in both the yards bylaw and the property standards bylaw. I'd like to first spend some time with the yard bylaw. For those of you that have downloaded it already, or for those of you that will be downloading it, you'll find that there's a fully detailed draft yard bylaw there. The one thing I'd like to note is that with all the changes that we are making, if we wrote them into the document as a series of changes, it would be very confusing, very complicated, very difficult for the average individual to understand. So what we decided to do is present the yard bylaw as a brand new bylaw so you could see the whole thing from beginning to end. It does mean that anything that the municipality currently has in terms of the yard bylaw, because there is one, and anything that's in that is effectively still useful has been brought forward. And it's not necessarily easy to see where the new pieces and the old pieces are. And so that's why I'm glad that I'm giving a chance to walk you through these and point out the pieces that are salient to the update that we're doing. So the old bylaw will disappear in the passage of time, and this new one will come forward when it's been fully refined after consultation and we're ready to put it in front of council. So what you'll find in the yard bylaw is you'll find some definitions added around a naturalized area. You'll find in section 5.1 in Schedule A clarity on what is a weed, and this draws from best practices from other parts of Ontario, other municipalities, and there actually is an interesting piece of legislation in Ontario that defines weeds that enables municipalities to actually control that. So it's not just a local jurisdiction matter. There's actually enabling legislation specifically on weeds that we've learned through the course of all of our research. And we tried to create a definition around landscaping so that we could, again, encourage good landscaping and also provide some clarity if the municipality is asked to check out a property because someone has filed a complaint. Effectively, all of this is a complaints-based process. Somebody in the community sees something that they think is not appropriate, they're going to they may choose to call the municipality. The municipality will send someone out, and the person that's standing there on the side of the road from the town of Smiths Falls has to be able to look at the bylaw and be able to say, well, the bylaw says it's this, and as far as I can see, it's not a problem, even though that individual may have complained about it. And what we're trying to do is offer some clarity there. Because that was not present in the previous version of either the property standards or the yard bylaw. So the other thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to do a combination of both avoid concerns and resolve concerns in a progressive kind of forthright manner by providing some clear, again, definitions here. So having turf grass and weeds beyond a certain height of growth and facilitating in those rare instances where bylaw enforcement has to intervene to make sure that they know exactly what that is. You'll see specific wording around 20 centimeters from the grade to the topmost growth of those types of plants. We did introduce a concept in regards to being out of character with the surrounding environment. And I'll expand on that one a little bit further, is that we are in a town context. So we're within a settlement area. We're within, an urban setting. We've got asphalt roads and curbs and sidewalks and those types of things. We're not way out in the rural area. And there is an element of context here that Martina, my colleague and expert in landscape, had shared with us in a previous presentation. It is about trying to make sure that what we're doing in terms of our landscaping approaches is progressive and is part of sustainable development and design, while at the same time is suitable within an urban living environment. So we're not trying to turn everything into wilderness, even though we were in Smiths Falls. We're trying to find that middle ground. You'll also find in section 5.4 of the draft yard bylaw an interesting kind of conflict resolution technique where we've indicated that if we need to find a vehicle to resolve a misunderstanding, or person X says this and person Y says that, there's a tool that we use in Ontario quite frequently, which is to call in an expert on the subject. And so we're drawing from that best practice in the way that other things are resolved in this province. And so if we bring in a landscape architect, someone who's duly qualified, and they say, you know what, in my opinion as a professional landscape architect, this is perfectly acceptable, then we should just accept that professional opinion because of their expertise and their training. It is a good professional opinion, and that can help resolve conflict. And we thought that would be a very helpful tool to introduce into the yard bylaw. What you'll also find in the yard bylaw is matters of general good maintenance that we've tried to make clear. So on the instances in a yard setting where we have a vast amount of uncontrolled growth, because we, again, have that 0.001% individual who just is horribly negligent, we have a set of rules in and around that. So if the type of growth is hindering pedestrians on a public sidewalk, blocking sight lines at intersections, we've had a property that is left in such a way that there's no ground cover, and now on a windy day all of that dry dust is blowing onto neighboring properties. That's not considered appropriate in a settlement environment, in an urban environment. That's not being a good neighbor, and these rules are not uncommon in other parts of Ontario. If we've got a decaying tree that's simply left to rot and hasn't been properly maintained, it could collapse and fall on a neighboring property. We want to make sure that that is clearly articulated. If we have areas that are piled up with snow and ice, creating unsafe conditions for walkways and driveways, that's not appropriate, and the municipality may be called to intervene from time to time. And so we wanted that to be clear. If we have an area where the land has not been looked after and suddenly there's a large depression and that causes a ponding of stormwater when it rains, and then that could create a drainage issue and have an impact on surrounding properties. Or if land isn't properly graded, then when it rains really hard, the water runs off that property and might flood that neighboring person's basement. These are real concerns that citizens do face. And then generally, as it relates to just general upkeep, having clarity about unsanitary, unhealthy, or dangerous conditions. So, vast amounts of garbage or other things piled up in a yard that have been left there unattended is not appropriate in a community, in a town like Smiths Falls or in most other urban areas. So that's really the long and short of what general good maintenance looks like, and that's peppered throughout various sections of the yard bylaw. And hopefully by me calling out those specific pieces, if you're looking at the bylaw yourself, you'll be able to identify those as you see them. So I have a little bit more of a presentation. I won't take up much more time because I do want to make sure that I leave time for Q&A. And depending on the questions, I'll ask my colleague Martina to weigh in because she is the landscape expert here. But I'll give you a bit of the walkthrough of the property standards bylaw. Similarly, as I explained to the yards bylaw, Smiths Falls has an existing property standards bylaw right now. It is a robust bylaw and is common and typical for the type of property standards bylaw you would see in other municipalities around Ontario. But what we've done in terms of the draft is we've created a brand new one, started from a clean slate and presented it as a full, nice and clean, easy to read document. Because with the changes we've made, it would be very convoluted and very complicated to try to read through all of the different changes for the average citizen or layperson. And so what will happen in the passage of time after we refine it is the brand new one will come forward and we will ask council to adopt it. Again, because we've presented it as essentially a clean version, I'd like to take a few moments during the course of this part of the presentation to just point out the key changes that we've made. Essentially, what we're trying to do is make sure that the spirit of the property standards bylaw is aligned with the spirit of the legislation under which it is set out. And so the spirit of that legislation is around health and safety. And so that's what we want the property standards bylaw to be focused on. So what we'll see here, when you open that document or when you download it from the internet, or if you happen to have it open in front of you right now, is a few additions to sections 6 and sections 9 and 22 in regards to the cleaning of mold, should that be accumulated in a building and become an issue and the source of a complaint requiring investigation by the municipality. Similarly, as it relates to vermin. So you know, rodents and insects, all those types of things. Again, should they become a problem and lead to a complaint filed with the municipality, ultimately resulting in a bylaw enforcement officer having to pay a visit to that property. We want to have a clear kind of rule and definition around that. And then accumulations of ice or snow that create a hazard from a property standards perspective. Again, in here, you'll see some additions around general good repair that did not exist previously in the property standards bylaw. As I said, the bylaw to itself is quite comprehensive. The document that you'll download is quite sizable. And in fact, we've only actually made a handful of additions as it relates to this particular update. The vast majority of what you see in the document is currently in effect at the town of Smiths Falls in the current property standards bylaw. But as it relates to matters of general good repair, you'll find references in sections 16 and 23 as it relates to kitchen cupboards and cabinets in good repair, appliances in good repair, and catch basins free of obstructions. And so for those that aren't familiar with the technical terminology, catch basins, those are those storm grates that you see out on properties sometimes. And when it rains, the water goes into those storm grates, flows into the storm sewer, and then that storm sewer outlets that storm water to a nearby water course. Now, if those are obstructed and backed up, then that water can't get in there and it's going to cause a flooding problem. So that's what that one is all about. With that, hopefully I've done a good job of bringing everyone up to a common level of knowledge as it relates to the process that we've been through, the research that we've conducted, what we've learned along the way, and hopefully I've helped point out the key pieces in both the draft yard bylaw as well as the draft property standards bylaw to help orient you to some of the changes that are being proposed. With that, I really do thank you very much for your kind attention and your patience as I've provided the walkthrough. And I very much look forward to all of the questions and comments and feedback that we will receive today. And certainly at that point, Carrie, please let me know what questions you may have received or if there's anything that's currently in the queue. Otherwise, I do have one to get us started.
Okay. Right now, I don't see anything in the chat. Ish has provided links to all the documents on Speak Up Smiths Falls, and there's nothing coming through on the Facebook commenting. I did have some questions and comments that came through yesterday, Rory, and I sent them to you ahead of time. There was questions regarding some of the terminology, some of the terms that are used in the bylaw, such as overgrown, untidy, unsightly, that are used repeatedly, about maybe clarifying those definitions. And then there was questions. There was 4 questions that I don't know if you're prepared to answer these tonight, or if these are things that you can take away to look at about incorporating in the bylaw. But one was about neighboring properties. Why are neighboring properties the standard of what is allowed? And there's a second question: does the provision mean that even habitant logs, i.e. dead limbs, that do not create an unsafe condition are prohibited? There's a third one that does this mean that all street trees in Smiths Falls that are within 3 meters of the street or curb are not allowed and need to be cut down? And the fourth was regarding clause 6.3, and I apologize, I don't have that right in front of me. Why does this clause force the use of herbicides when there are other non-chemical means of controlling poison ivy and giant hogweed? And I do see the author of these questions has raised her hand. Mm-hmm. So perhaps if Ish could allow Lorraine Johnson to speak, she may want to ask these questions directly or have comments.
Yeah. So Ish, maybe we'll do 2 things simultaneously. Since Lorraine is here, good evening to you, Lorraine. I'm glad that you're able to join us. We did receive the questions in advance. Perhaps to maybe assist in getting things rolling, what I can do is offer a bit of feedback on the questions that were sent in by email. And then if there's further questions from yourself, by all means, we would love to hear them. And then, of course, everyone else that's in attendance today is encouraged to raise their hand and ask any other questions. But so what I'll do is I'll get started a little bit. The kind of lead-in question that we did receive was, why are we calling out naturalization? Like, what's the purpose of this? And because isn't it just landscaping? And I agree with you. In the grand scheme of things, at the end of the day, it is just landscaping. And what we are finding is that we are in a transition period where some people understand this, some people don't. And so we have to do kind of 2 things. We have to provide vehicles for education, and then we have to make sure that the rules that we have in place are not going to kind of create unnecessary friction or over administration. And so through the course of this transitional period, that's where the concept for naturalization has come up, and why we are looking at actually identifying it in the bylaw. So by identifying it, we can identify it. We can attempt to say this is okay. This is not a bad thing. And we're hoping that in doing that, we can then resolve conflict, because what has happened is that there's been unnecessary amounts of conflict, because one person says this is not right, and when in fact, generally speaking, we think that there's actually more good happening than there is bad, and all the various things that I've seen around Ontario in various communities around naturalization. Maybe Martina, did you want to kind of speak to some of the naturalization that you've been seeing in Ontario, and that perspective of that there's more good than bad happening?
Rory, could I get you to stop the screen share just so I can see all the participants, yes, if you don't mind?
Thank you very much. Yes,
my apologies. Sorry to interrupt you, Lorraine.
Thank you. That's a good reminder. Thank you. Martina, on naturalization?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, certainly we've seen through the projects that we worked on, and when it comes to building sustainable communities, planning for sustainable communities, and in general through different policies and what we have been working on with Smiths Falls on the standard side and bylaws, it's very it's becoming the norm, right? It's becoming the norm, and as we all walk around our communities, we see that that interpretation of the extent of naturalization has been that preference, individual or household preference. So it's certainly a shift in the right direction, I think, for Smiths Falls to be having this as a discussion and having something that has more substance to it as a bylaw that as a community you could refer to, actually just strengthens sort of the practice for those that are interested to further their landscape and naturalization efforts. It supports it because then, you know, certain bylaw reinforcement or whomever, like there's, or maybe the neighbors, like it opens up a really good dialogue. So it's actually very forward thinking, and I think it's it's where a lot of municipalities, larger municipalities, have gone. So that's why I'm saying that for a smaller community as yours, this is fantastic to see.
Yeah. Thanks, Martina. What I'll do for Lorraine's benefit is I'll offer some additional kind of thoughts on the kind of key subjects that were raised in the questions. And then Lorraine, I promise I'll shut up. And if you had other questions you'd like to ask of me, then by all means, please go ahead. So on the kind of concept of how precise the language needs to be, you know, untidy, unkempt, unclear, we are trying on for size some of the wording, knowing that it is kind of difficult sometimes to pin it down exactly. And then that's why we kind of put a draft out there. We wanted to see the type of public feedback that we were going to get. So what we are still trying to do is walk a line in the bylaw between flexibility versus enabling enforcement, recognizing that it is a complaints-based process. Only if there is a complaint will the municipality send bylaw enforcement, and only if that happens do we actually want bylaw enforcement to get involved on things that are actually significant problems. We actually want bylaw enforcement to look at it and say, you know what, this is not really a thing. So we're just going to walk away. Because I think like that's the reality here. And in without offering some of that flexibility, then we end up in an unnecessary enforcement regime. So we'll continue to work on the language. I'm glad that you brought it to our attention. So that's a takeaway for us. I would like to also respond to a concept around freedom of expression and share this really with all of our audience this evening, is that there is a charter of rights and freedoms matter here as it relates to freedom of expression. And how you choose to landscape your yard, if it is your property, is indeed a freedom of expression matter. And this has actually been tested in the courts in the past on a variety of matters, not only to landscape, but, you know, if someone wants to paint their building yellow, you kind of are allowed to do that. Because that's a freedom of expression thing. So what we are trying to do is trying to figure out how everyone can enjoy that freedom of expression and enjoy, you know, their property, their yard, and landscape it the way that they like, and do it in such a way that we all can live happily together in a community, and encourage that type of kind of relationship. So does it mean that if one person who has this beautifully manicured grass, turf, lawn sets the standard for the person that lives beside them? I don't think so. If it, in terms of a glance at the bylaw, it feels like that's what the bylaw is trying to do, I'm again glad that you've brought that to our attention. This is why we seek consultation, and we have a takeaway to refine that. On some other matters around dead branches and things like that, again, the intent is for bylaw enforcement to have clear rules if they need to step in on something that is egregious. You know, just because a branch fell down in your front yard, you know, and because it was a bad storm last night, doesn't necessarily, where our intention is not to send bylaw enforcement chasing after that homeowner. So again, a takeaway for us. And then on the matter of herbicides, we just identified that as a best practice in terms of some other bylaws. Yes, there are indeed other ways of handling certain types of plants and growth. Specifically, I will say, at least from my understanding, and Martina, correct me if I'm wrong, giant hogweed is particularly nefarious and is extremely dangerous to handle. You know, even if you have, you know, gloves and protective layers on. So because of that, I think, you know, that's why we are seeing an allowance for chemical herbicides to deal with that specific type of plant because of how dangerous that plant is. Anything else to add as it relates to giant hogweed, Martina? Because that's a particularly pesky plant.
I think just in terms of the time, maybe we could pause on that one and see if there's time I can respond to it.
Okay, sure. So again, try to offer some perspective on a variety of questions. Lorraine, you've waited patiently with your hand up I'm not sure who has control of the microphone, but if someone would like to unmute Lorraine, then please go ahead, Lorraine.
I think I've managed to unmute myself. Thanks.
Oh, excellent. So good.
And Rory, when you apologized and said, "Oh, I'll shut up now." No need to shut up. I appreciate all your, explanations and thoughts. I guess, and I'm glad that you brought up the freedom of expression issue, because one thing that really struck me when I read through the draft was that it was full of language that's aesthetically based, like unsightly, the phrase proper gardens, proper landscaping, terms like that are used. And so I guess I wondered if you'd had the chance to read through, because of course a bylaw is a legal instrument. So, I'm assuming that, and because you mentioned the freedom of expression issue, that you've got some familiarity with the court cases that have ruled on naturalization, and these court cases have been so specific in the Sandy Bell case and the Douglas Counter case that, and you said yourself about the spirit of the legislation being health and safety. So the courts have been really clear. Aesthetics, aesthetic terms are too vague, they're too arbitrary, and they can't be enforced. So I guess I was wondering why the draft is so full of aesthetic-based language, and that the courts have ruled is unenforceable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because to be fairly plain about it, Lorraine, it is a draft, and we wanted to try it on for size and see what type of feedback that we receive, because we know that there's a diverse audience there. And it's a starting point, and we wanted to give ourselves an opportunity to have conversations with yourself and other members of the community, other stakeholders out there, and engage in the dialogue. Because if through the course of this consultation and the consultation with others, the general feeling in the community is that the public interest is around what is very clear, what is precise, what can be made as black and white as possible, then we will move the bylaw in that ultimate final direction, and we will put it in front of council on the basis of that's why it is the way it is. And so we want to be able to bring it to council with a strong kind of collective voice of the community behind it.
Yeah, and I really want to commend you in terms of the specificity around the weeds in the schedule, the weeds that are listed. I just think that's enormously helpful. It and it's the way to go. It gives people clarity about what plants are allowed and what plants aren't allowed. I mean, you mentioned the Provincial Weed Control Act and the list that's there, but my understanding is actually that it's the ministry, I think it's natural resources, I guess, or agriculture and food, sorry, that does that list. They've been very clear that it doesn't apply to urban areas. It's actually an agricultural list. So the fact that you've included a schedule with prohibited weeds is, I think, so very helpful. But I just, in terms of the court decisions and that the idea of sort of putting out a draft that is, clearly full of language that contravenes the court decisions. I guess I'm wondering, why would we be talking about terms that, you've said that it's good to have public discussion around those terms, but why would we have public discussion around terms that have been ruled illegal as when they're included in a bylaw around yards?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think Lorraine, you are a kind of bit of an Illuminati here. I think, and that's a compliment, because you have looked at this and you're studying it and you're well versed in it. And I was hoping that through the course of the public consultation tonight, the audience with us, we're kind of able to help them, share and learn as well. So, the fact that we're actually having this dialogue, and you're sharing and imparting your knowledge I think is helping others in the community learn about this too. And I believe that that is helpful. And then as we move from here forward, then the precision and the specificity and the narrowing of the subject matter to make a good bylaw is where we're going to end up. So, you know, that's what I'm happy to say. The other thing I'd like to acknowledge is my wife was in a session with a First Nation elder, and they were explaining that you know, they themselves have a different perspective on certain plants. And the elder said, well, you know, in typical Western society, that plant is, you all consider it a weed, but for us, it's an important plant to us. And it was kind of perfectly timed. It was just yesterday that my wife brought this information, this knowledge to me from a First Nation elder, and I thought, you know, it couldn't have been better timing to share during tonight's consultation, is that there are these different perspectives around the plants in our community, and we don't have to encourage a monoculture anymore, because really there's a more sustainable way to live.
Thanks. I'll let others people speak. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for sharing, Lorraine.
Thank you, Lorraine. I get excited when we actually get feedback on draft bylaws. So when she sent through her questions yesterday, and it was obvious that she had taken the time to review, it was exciting for a clerk. We do have a email or a question that came up through the chat, Rory, and it was regarding the initial survey that we conducted. And it asked, did the survey ask how many Smiths Falls residents have naturalized properties currently?
I think there's a simple answer there, Carrie. It wasn't one of the questions that was asked. The survey was intended to kind of gauge, you know, a little bit of kind of broad public philosophy around it, rather than collect an inventory. If what I'm seeing just within the 2 or 3 blocks of where I walk my daughter to school is indicative of what's going on more broadly across communities in Ontario and across Canada, is that we will see more and more people embracing a different approach to their landscaping and introducing things like wildflowers and other types of plants. And you know, some folks will go to a more fully naturalized approach, like my neighbor directly across from me, and others will go to a bit of a hybrid approach where they're going to have a bit of grass and some other things. So, you know, I think it's okay that we don't know how many people are naturalizing or making that choice. I'm encouraged to think that you know, we'll see more citizens you know, making some of these good choices, trying to help pollinators and all these other good things that come from choosing alternatives than turf grass.
And we have a question, and this is more for me. Does Smiths Falls have a separate sight line bylaw? We do not. We have various bylaws that speak to impeding sight lines, impeding vehicle traffic, impeding pedestrian traffic. We have different bylaws. Our sign bylaw incorporates parts of that, as our street occupancy bylaw does as well, property standards. So we don't have one specific, but we do have multiple bylaws that do have provisions in it for sight lines. And that is all the questions I have so far in the chat. I'm just scrolling to make sure I haven't missed anybody. Happy to say we've got people joining, Lorraine joining from Toronto and Perth. We have people from other communities joining us this evening, so that's fantastic. There's no other questions in the chat, Rory, and I'm not seeing any questions in the comment or the comments in the Facebook feed, but I am seeing quite a few people watching, which is fantastic. So I'm not sure if there's any other questions for those on the Zoom or.
So maybe what I'll do then, Carrie, is I don't want to cut short an opportunity for public dialogue. I value the participation of community members near and far on this type of subject matter. I am going to put Martina on the spot, but I'm going to give her a second to you know, get prepared for it. But again, I'm going to kind of circle back on the matter of naturalization and some of the things that she's seeing as a landscape professional. And you know, some of the things that encourages her about the future of sustainable design in communities. Maybe Martina, while you share some of that perspective, our citizens our audience might come up with some other questions that they can pose to us. And again, we welcome any question that that our participants may have. But Martina, can I give you the floor for a moment or two?
Sure, sure. I think, you know, as sort of alluded to earlier, certainly with the questions sort of and the discussions that we are having tonight, this is fantastic feedback, and it is something that we're going to be looking into, because I think, you know, it's one thing to say from as a designer to say, this is what we designed, this is what I designed, but how do you kind of on the flip side, you know, Rory working with you and Carrie with you and the community, how do we kind of instill this into something that can actually have a means to regulate or enforce? So that this has been interesting for me as well, to kind of work on the other side and how that complements the design effort, which is typically kind of my realm. So I think through the brochure, hopefully, as we develop these, take the feedback we received tonight, and if there's any other comments that spill through as a result of anyone watching this afterwards, any feedback is fantastic feedback. It gives us the window of, you know, any concern, any ideas you may have on what has been presented to date. And we will be taking this draft work, and on with that brochure, have a draft that will start to, and Lorraine, like you mentioned as well, like just start to think of like very strategically and like with a lot of intent, what do we want to actually, how do we guide the community to having fun doing this, to being inspired to do this, to feeling good about doing something that is actually a positive action forward in terms of a sustainable action, and then also being supportive and understanding if their neighbor, sister, mother-in-law, whoever is not in the same, doesn't share the same perspective. And so I think in that brochure, and which is sort of one of the next steps for us, next action items, we hope to kind of provide some of that guidance and education on the key principles to planting, maintaining, and sustaining a naturalized, diverse, ecological, you could say yard, and that could be at different scales.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm glad that you did remind us all, Martina, about that other piece that we are working on behind the scenes, and it's not yet ready, but I think it's an important part of the overall equation. So yes, the bylaws are the bylaws. We know that they need to be refined, and the bylaws have a specific purpose in terms of should the municipality need to intervene on a property because it's been left in a state of disrepair, neglect or otherwise, that it has the tools to be able to clearly identify what those are and take action. But in the large gray area that exists until we get to that point, we are working on this yards naturalization brochure, and the brochure is, as Martina has said, is supposed to encourage people, and if they're going to be doing yards naturalization, to maybe offer them a little bit of helpful advice coming from a landscape professional such as Martina, and encourage them to think about how they could make some choices about their plants and how they could organize some of the spaces and so on and so forth, and again, allow them to make those choices that are the freedom of expression choices. And because the brochure is just an information piece, it's not about the rules and requirements. It's about encouraging those good things. And everything that I've seen so far is people really do appreciate having a brochure, to be able to pick something up from the municipal counter on yards naturalization, or to be able to download a brochure and say, oh, this is helpful, it gives me some guidance, and now I can take that to the store that I typically go to buy my plants, and I can show them the brochure, and the person can help me, and they're like, oh great, you would like to do that, excellent, we have some excellent choices that you can make here, let me show you those things, and they're out there beautifying their property and creating a more sustainable urban environment. So I think that brochure is a very exciting thing. Please stay tuned on this process. Anyone that's registered for the Zoom, we will have recorded your email, and as we move forward, we will be reaching out to you, keeping you apprised of next steps. So again, please do stay tuned for that.
So
Lorraine, sorry,
no.
go ahead, Carrie.
I was just going to say, Lorraine is asking if it's okay. She has one more question. Of course it is.
Yes, of course. Lorraine, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. It's really great to hear about this emphasis on educational materials. I think all of the municipalities that have moved in this direction, or not all of them, but the ones that have had the most success are the ones that have really devoted a lot of energy to providing free, good, science-based and inspiring materials about plants and planting and naturalization. So to help folks do that work. So I think it's really great that you're focusing and thinking about those educational materials. Just one clarification and then one question. My question about, and it was in the email, so we don't have to talk about it now, but the dead branches, and you mentioned, you know, it doesn't apply to branches that are falling down, like in a storm or something like that. Really what I was talking about were branches that are specific, so what are called habitat logs in the pollination literature and the naturalization literature, logs that are dead and decaying and are placed around a property to provide such important habitat. And I was a bit worried with the draft language that it prohibited habitat logs, or sometimes called nurse logs. So just to flag that as something maybe to think about down the road, how can that be written in a way that does not prohibit this amazing landscape feature for wildlife? So, but my question had to do with the work of the Ecological Design Lab at Metropolitan Toronto University. And the, what's it called? The Biodiversities Initiative. I know I've got it wrong. The North American group that's in conjunction with the Ecological Design Lab is doing a lot of work around bylaws, and it's being led by Professor Nina Marie Lister, who is a professional urban planner. She just won the Margolis Prize, or sorry, last year she won the Margolis Prize. So an amazing and well-respected urban planner, I'm sure you know, Professor Nina Marie Lister. But one of her graduate students, Carly Murphy, did a huge project, year-long or half a year-long project, looking at bylaws, grass and weeds yard bylaws across the country, across North America, and came up with a model bylaw looking at best practices. And I just wondered, and then it was also, this has been used in various contexts. And so in terms of reinventing the wheel or those sorts of things, are you familiar with the model bylaw? Have you had a chance to look at it? Have you considered, you know, the work that has gone on by, you know, groups of planners across North America to look at these bylaws and come up with best practices summarized in Carly's paper? I wondered if you had a chance to look at it and found, considered that model bylaw in your efforts.
I think I can speak to the institution and the professor. Maybe I'll ask Martina to speak on the subject matter. So I'm actually a grad of what was formerly Ryerson University, now Toronto Metropolitan University. Nina Marie Lister was one of my profs. So I'm glad that you mentioned the institution and her name. A great deal of respect for Nina Marie. I think she's fabulous. Every student I know loves her. So, you know, from that perspective, if any advice or anything that she's put her hands on, I'm definitely gonna look forward to learning more, because I don't think I've seen any of that work that's come through her. Martina, you know, any other thoughts here on that particular product or that subject matter?
Yeah, I believe from our early research, we did look at it as a reference, and maybe it is, as the project has progressed, maybe it is just something that, Lorraine, to your point, we can circle back and just make sure that any learnings and, successes from that particular piece of, I think it was thesis work, to see how we can, what sections and what ideas and sort of the philosophy is appropriately potentially embedded in this particular case, and what's appropriate for Smiths Falls. And I too echo just the amazing work by Nina Marie Lister, because she was also, I'm a U of T graduate myself, and from a master's of landscape architecture. And anytime I had opportunity to hear her speak, let alone get a critique on my own urban design studios by her, it was both an honor and also sometimes nerve-wracking. So a lot of respect, just a huge body of inspiration.
Yeah, I appreciate that you gave it some emphasis this evening, Lorraine. So we're going to actually go back and study that a lot more closely now. And I think what I can say is, you'll notice that in the next iteration of the bylaw, it'll benefit from our more closer inspection of that and trying to advance it and bring it towards a better alignment.
That's great to hear. Thanks.
So Lorraine has very kindly in the chat section given the name the Ecological Design Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University, if we want to Google that after the meeting. Thank you very much, Lorraine.
I'll also put in a public service plug for a book I found at my local library. I think, generally our audience present tonight is interested in yards naturalization. They want to see what the bylaw is saying and thinking about doing things on their own property in the future, or perhaps what they already have. So this is a book called, it's a little bit grayed out. It's hard to see because my Zoom has the blur on from my background, but I'll call it out by name. It's called Front Yard Gardens, Growing More Than Grass. And it's written by Liz Primeau, and the last name is spelled Primeau. And the nice thing about this book is it's actually Canadian author. So you're not going to see palm trees from Southern California. You're going to see landscapes that are very much natural and that are suitable for our eco-regions in Canada. So for those that are out there, curious about naturalization, there's lots of wonderful resources.
So Rory, I've got a question. Actually, one of the participants, Lorraine, has a question for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One of our participants is asking if there's any municipal bylaws that you would like to see Smiths Falls model, if there's any municipalities at the top of your head.
Yeah, well, this is actually thanks to the work and the scan of the bylaws across the country that Carly did. And Carly Murphy, who was the grad student who wrote the model bylaw. And the bylaw, the yard, grass and weeds, I can't remember the exact name of the bylaw, but basically it's the yard bylaw in Fredericton, New Brunswick, is incredibly concise, short. It actually, it doesn't go through great hoops to try to anticipate every possible scenario. It's focused on health and safety. It's clear, it's short. And so I would say, take a look at that one. But other than that, I would say there are problems with a lot of the bylaws. I would say that the vast majority of bylaws across the country are actually illegal. If they were tested in court, they wouldn't stand up. The yard bylaws across the country, it's just that for many, many reasons, it's a huge burden and cost emotionally, financially, to actually, initiate, to fight back basically against the clearly illegal, unconstitutional bylaws that incorporate this aesthetic language. So anyway, check out the Fredericton bylaw. The Toronto bylaw was changed recently, went through a big process. And I think and it's definitely better than it was, but I think what really became clear to me through that process is that clarity around enforcement of the bylaws is also crucial. you can have what seems like the clearest and good bylaw, well written, but if there's not training of enforcement, like very committed training of enforcement officers, and you know, weed identification, of those prohibited plants. I mean, you're asking folks who have a job that covers so many areas to also be plant experts. So, you know, there's so much room for misidentification of plants, and then somebody getting a notice of violation over a plant that's perfectly legal and not a prohibited plant. At any rate, so I think focus on enforcement too, and education of enforcement officers, and clear policies. Like, can someone just call up because they don't like their neighbor and complain, and there's no kind of requirement of naming what the problem is, which is the situation in most places now. You can just call and complain about your neighbor's yard in most, like in you know, in most municipalities, and you're not required to say, there is a health and safety issue, and here's what it is. And here's why I think you need to come out and commit municipal resources to looking into this, you know? So these bylaws are often used to fight neighbor battles, and they really shouldn't be. In the way that to prevent that is through some really a well-written bylaw and some really good enforcement policies as well. Thanks for asking, and thanks for letting me talk.
Thank you, Lorraine. Lorraine, do you happen to know the exact name of that bylaw in Fredericton? Or we can Google after.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know the exact name.
That's okay.
It is in Carly Murphy's paper on the Ecological Design Lab website.
Okay.
But yeah, you could find it Googling to yard bylaw, Fredericton, that sort of thing.
No, this is great discussion, so we appreciate it, Lorraine.
Yeah.
So Roy, just to keep you on track, I still have lots of people joining us on Facebook, which is great, but no comments or questions that I can see so far. And so far we're up to, there's no more additional questions in our chat feature.
Yeah, I just saw one come in, and it is more about process than it is about products.
My apologies, I just
Carrie?
got one come in there too.
Yeah, just popped in, and actually, perhaps that's actually a useful segue. So, you know, maybe I'll speak about moving forward, and I won't use the slides, even though I have one or two slides about moving forward. I think it's I can communicate this clearly verbally. So, what we're going to be doing after this evening's session is we're going to consider all the comments that have been received. We're going to go back into the draft bylaws that are currently posted, and we're going to continue to work on them and refine them and improve them. That's our goal from the outset. What will also happen is that Martina, as our landscape professional, will continue to advance her work on the complementary brochure for yard naturalization. And that will be drafted. And then what we will do is we will post the updated documents of the draft bylaws to Speak Up Smiths Falls, and we'll post the naturalization brochure alongside of those updated documents. For anyone that's been in touch with us through the initial survey, we have your email. For those that joined our any previous consultation and provided an email address, or for anyone who has communicated to the town, we've got your email address. And for anyone that signed on and registered for the Zoom, we have your email address. So all of you are on our email contact list now. And when those materials are posted, we will be sending out an email to everyone on the email contact list. We want you to see the next iteration of the material. And then as we do that, we'll be moving the bylaws forward to committee of the whole. At that time, if anyone has further information or something they'd like to share with the representatives of political leadership, that's a great opportunity to do that. Hopefully you'll be able to show up and maybe say a word of praise if you find that the bylaws actually are good bylaws. We would be very grateful for that. If you have a piece of constructive criticism, that's what a public process is all about. And then ultimately what happens in a municipality is after it gets tabled at committee of the whole, it would then move on to council for council adoption. So that's the process that we are looking ahead step by step. And as I said, for those on our email list, stay tuned. When we have the next package, we will reach out so that you are kept apprised, and we do encourage you to take a look at the next set of materials.
Thanks, Roy. And I'd encourage anybody who's watching, who's not registered on Zoom, but who's watching on Facebook or may watch this tomorrow or the next day on our YouTube channel. If there's anything that you want to have a question on or want to comment on, please reach out to the clerk's office. You can send an email to info@smithsfalls.ca. It'll be redirected to myself. And we'll make sure that Dylan gets those comments or questions. We want to make sure that anybody who's had a comment or has a question that they get replied to, or that they feel that they know their comment has been heard. So this video will probably be posted tomorrow, if not later tonight. I don't need to put pressure on our live stream company. So, you know, we would encourage people to make contact with us with any comments or questions, and we're happy to pass those on to Dylan or answer them ourselves if we can.
And hopefully everyone can see the coordinates on the screen. If you'd like to send in something by snail mail, that's town of Smiths Falls, 77 Beckwith Street North, Smiths Falls, Ontario, postal code K7A2B8. If you wish to communicate by telephone, the local number is 613-283-4124. Toll free from the area, but outside of the calling area code is 1-888-983-4124. And if you'd like to send an email, please do so at info@smithsfalls.ca. So,
and I don't see any more comments or questions coming in, Rory. So at this point, I very much appreciate everybody's attendance tonight. I very much appreciate people taking the time to review the proposed bylaw and participate in a public meeting. As many who are on this call know right now, public meetings aren't generally well attended. And I'm really happy to say that we do have people in attendance on Zoom tonight, and we've had people watching on Facebook. So that's encouraging. And I hope that more people will watch the YouTube video after the fact. So Dylan Consulting, I thank all of you and your staff for your work tonight. I thank everybody who's participated in any fashion in this meeting, and we're here to listen and to please reach out with any further comments or questions. So I think no more questions are coming in. So I thank all of you, and we will adjourn this public meeting at